say he burned the cross, but in the end, it was the cross and the crowd that burned him. The air in Saint-Gilles carried the scent of smoke and old parchment. A man stood bound before a pyre, its base stacked not with timber alone, but with his own books. He had once preached that no wooden symbol could hold the divine, that salvation was not carved, hammered, or gilded. That faith was a fire of the soul, not a relic to be kissed. Those words had spread like a spark in dry grass, and the church knew it. They called him a heretic. The people he once moved to tears now shouted for his death. The flames rose, licking at the pages that had once carried his voice. And in that moment, Peter of Bruys did not look like a man defeated. To understand how a monk became the most hated man in all of Provence, we must step back into an age when the church ruled not just the land, but the soul itself. In the 12th century, the church was not simply a faith, it was the pulse that kept medieval Europe alive. It rang in the bells at dawn, glimmered in the candles of evening mass, and echoed in the Latin prayers that only the priests understood. In villages and great cities alike, it was the church that measured time. Its feast days set the rhythm of the year. Its decrees reached further than any king's command. And when a man died, it was the church that claimed to hold the keys to his eternal fate. This was an age where no man stood apart from its reach. A peasant could not marry without its blessing. A merchant could not prosper without its favor. Even lords bent the knee, for a single excommunication could turn a castle into a prison of fear. Belief was not a private matter. It was the law of survival. The cross was not just wood, it was protection. The altar was not just stone, it was the heart of the community. To doubt either was to cut yourself off, not only from God, but from the very world that fed and sheltered you. And yet, there were always whispers, stories of those who questioned whether the incense truly carried prayers to heaven, whether gold chalices and jeweled reliquaries brought any soul closer to salvation. Such thoughts were dangerous. They were shared in hushed voices, in corners, with glances over the shoulder. The church had endured schisms, false prophets, and even rival popes. But its greatest fear was not the rebellion of armies. It was the rebellion of a single mind that refused to bow. In the bustling town of Saint-Gilles, that mind would soon find its voice. It would belong to a man who had once worn the robes of the faithful, a man who knew the weight of every ritual and the fragility hidden behind the certainty. And as that voice began to rise, from the echoing cloisters to the crowded marketplace, it would carry words sharp enough to pierce the armor of tradition itself. He had not been born a rebel. Peter entered the church as so many young men did, with a sense of duty and a hunger to serve. The monastery doors in Provence opened to him with the promise of purpose, a place where life had meaning beyond the fields and the marketplace. The rhythm of the cloister was simple, almost comforting. Prayers at dawn, study by candlelight, silence in the corridors. He learned the Latin of the scriptures, the weight of the liturgy, the authority that came with the robe. For years he followed it all, not as a prisoner, but as a son of the church. Yet obedience is not the same as agreement. Some questions do not shout, they whisper. And the whispers began when he saw the faith of the poor measured in coins placed at the altar. He noticed the farmer's wife who lit candles for her dead husband and went home hungry because she had paid the priest. He heard the murmurs of those who wondered why their children must be baptized before they could even speak their own name. He read the Gospels and found no command to kneel before carved wood. These thoughts did not come all at once. They crept in, like water through a crack in stone, and once inside, they widened. Still, Peter preached what he was told. He gave the blessings. He held the cross high. But inside, a different sermon was forming. One he could not speak aloud. Not yet. Because in a world where one word against the church could end a man, silence was not weakness. It was preparation. And somewhere deep within that silence, the monk began to imagine what it might sound like if one day he broke it. If you've ever wondered what happens when conviction finally outweighs fear, you'll want to hear where Peter's voice went next. When Peter finally spoke, he did not choose safe words. He chose fire. Not the fire of anger, but the fire of conviction. Words shaped to burn through the habits of a lifetime. He declared that baptism was no ritual for infants. Only those old enough to choose their faith could step into the water. It was not the priest's duty to claim a soul before it could even speak. He refused the veneration of the cross. To him, it was wood and nails, nothing more. If Christ had been killed with a sword, he asked, would you wear a sword around your neck? He rejected the great stone churches as the dwelling place of God. The true church, he said, was the gathering of believers, not walls, not towers, not gold leaf on the altar. He denied the mystery of the Eucharist. Bread was bread, wine was wine. To pretend otherwise was to blind the faithful with ceremony. And he would not pray for the dead. The fate of a soul, he claimed, was sealed at death. No whispered words could change it. Each teaching was a blow struck against the pillars of medieval faith. But together, they formed a hammer aimed at the very foundation of the Church's power. And in a time when faith and order were one, to strike at faith was to strike at the order itself. These words did not drift quietly into the air. They spread. From market stalls to roadside inns, from shepherds in the hills to merchants in the ports of Provence, his ideas carried a dangerous weight. And when dangerous ideas take root, there will always be those willing to follow them into the open. He did not win them with miracles. He won them with sentences that cut. He spoke in the open air, the market at Saint-Gilles, the roads to Arles, the riverbank where fishermen mended their nets. No gilded pulpit, no incense, just a man with a hard voice and a steadier gaze. He named things plainly: faith without purchase, repentance without spectacle, a church made of living people, not stone. At first they listened from a distance. Shopkeepers kept their hands busy, but their eyes drifted over. Field hands leaned on their tools. Mothers quieted children. A few priests hovered at the edge, measuring every word. The poor heard relief. The priests heard revolt. He did not taunt relics. He questioned them. If God was near, why must a man pay to feel it? If grace was real, why did it look so much like trade? A silence took hold. Not the silence of boredom, the silence of minds turning. Stories traveled faster than carts. Inns repeated his lines by lamplight. Travelers carried them to Nimes, to Avignon, across Provence. Some said he was stripping the sacred from the world. Others said he was giving it back to them. It was not only the desperate who followed him, it was the devout. There were quarrels in kitchens. There were arguments at wells. A father told his son that baptism should come with choice. A daughter asked her mother why a wooden cross should demand a kiss. Not hatred, hunger. A raw hunger to know what faith looked like without fear. The clerics answered with authority. They reminded the towns of councils and creeds, of an order older than any man alive. But order is only as strong as the hearts that hold it, and hearts, once moved, do not easily return to where they were. He began to preach closer to the churches, not inside, outside where anyone could stand. Men who once bowed at the procession now lingered at his circle first, then entered Mass late, then stopped entering at all. The lines blurred. Who was faithful, who was dangerous, and who decided? When a crowd is moved by conscience instead of custom, who still controls the square? The pressure built in small ways. A merchant delayed a donation. A widow refused to pay for prayers for her dead. A priest found his homily interrupted, not by shouting, but by questions he could not answer quickly. Questions became gatherings. Gatherings became momentum. No one remembered who spoke at first, only that the words fell like a verdict. If the cross is only wood, then let wood answer. Men looked at one another, half afraid, half certain. Hands that had never defied a procession reached toward a roadside shrine. They lifted a weathered cross from its stones, faces tight, with something between grief and resolve. The crowd moved, slow at first, then with purpose, toward the open square where Peter had been speaking. Not a riot, not yet. A decision taking shape. The air tasted of dust and heat. A wind pushed ash along the cobbles, and the first thing to burn would not be a soul, it would be wood. The wood answered first. A roadside cross came down, a dull thud on the stones. A gasp ran through the circle like wind through wheat. Hands steadied it. A hammer found its target. Iron gave way. Not hatred, not frenzy. Something colder, more deliberate. They carried the cross to the open square of Saint-Gilles. Not a procession with incense, a procession of breath and resolve. A mason brought kindling. A fisher's boy brought dry rushes. An old woman, silent, placed a taper at the base. If the sacred was only wood, then let the wood prove itself. A priest pushed forward, palms raised. He spoke of relics, of order, of the long memory of the medieval church. His words met faces that did not sneer. They grieved. A widow stepped between them, voice low. She had paid for prayers. Her husband stayed dead. And the square heard it. Not an argument, a wound. Flame took the straw first, then the splinters, then the crossbeam. Resin hissed. Smoke climbed the tower's shadow. Some watched with their lips pressed thin. Others watched with tears they did not wipe away. A child hid behind his mother's skirt. She did not tell him to look away. It felt less like blasphemy and more like verdict. One cross became two. A wayside shrine yielded its burden. A workshop gave a cracked crucifix long kept for mending. Iron bent, wood bowed, the pile grew. No shouting yet, only the low churn of voices, the heavy sound of decision. Peter did not stand above them. He stood among them. His face carried no triumph. He spoke the same sentences he had spoken on the road and in the market. Faith without purchase, repentance without spectacle. The crowd repeated them under their breath, as if trying on new clothes and finding to their surprise that they fit. The priest tried again. He named councils, creeds, the long chain from apostle to altar. A young man asked why a chain should choke the free. A girl asked why a symbol should receive a kiss no heart could give. Questions did not break the square. They steadied it. Then something shifted, not in the fire, in the faces. A merchant who had delayed a donation threw his ledger's broken clasp into the flames. A tanner set down his knife, crossed himself, and stepped back with eyes closed, as if expecting the sky to split. When it did not, he opened them and wept, quietly, almost relieved. The bell in the tower began its hour. No one moved to the church doors. Heat rose off the stones. Ash flecked the hems of robes and aprons. The scent of burning oak mingled with wax and old parchment. Words traveled from this square to the wharf, from the wharf to the inns, from the inns to the narrow lanes where cloisters kept their silence. What burned today was not God. What burned today was the habit of not asking. By late afternoon, the bonfire had a memory. It remembered every hand that fed it. It kept the shape of each cross long enough for the people to see it lose its power. A boy traced a charred grain with a stick, as if learning a new letter. His father pulled him close, unsure whether to be proud or afraid. The priest withdrew, not defeated, but alarmed by how calmly the town had changed. And still there was no riot. Only a tightening, like a fist that had not yet closed. Doors were barred early, shutters latched. The monks at vespers sang louder than usual, as if volume could anchor certainty. It would not stop with wood. When the fire sank to coals, the talk did not cool. Men argued in whispers. Women counted coins and kept them. Children asked questions at table that had never been asked aloud. Saint-Gilles looked the same at dusk, but its breath had shortened. Night gathered in the alleys, and rumor learned the streets by heart. Somewhere a message rode for a bishop. Somewhere a sermon was rewritten with teeth. The wind turned, carrying smoke back toward the cloister walls, and the town, medieval, faithful, proud, felt the weight of what it had done and of what might answer it by morning. The night did not cool the square, it only hardened it. By dawn, Saint-Gilles was awake but quieter than it should have been. Merchants rolled open shutters. Priests crossed the streets in pairs. Townsfolk passed each other without the usual greetings. The fire from the day before had left its mark in more than ash. Rumor traveled faster than the bells. It told of the crosses burned, of the priest turned back by his own flock, of Peter's voice standing against the cathedral itself. In the taverns, men spoke his words as if testing them. In the cloisters, monks read aloud the church's decrees against heresy with sharper emphasis. And in between those walls, stone or flesh, a pressure began to build. The bishop's envoys arrived before midday. Not soldiers, not yet. Men in dark robes, their hoods drawn despite the warmth. They asked questions with the politeness of those who already knew the answers. Which homes had Peter visited? Which families had stopped attending Mass? Who had helped carry the crosses? Every answer, or refusal, was noted. A widow turned away from her own doorway when they stepped inside uninvited. A young man spat at the ground and said he owed them nothing. An old mason simply closed his eyes until the questions stopped. The sermons that week grew longer, heavier. They spoke not of Christ's mercy, but of his wrath, not of heaven, but of hell. Fear was meant to bring the people back, but fear, once tasted, can change its flavor. Peter kept speaking. He chose no stage, no pulpit, only the steps of the well, the shade of the olive trees, the edges of the market where the smell of fish and spice could not hide the sound of his voice. Those who came near did not always agree, but they stayed. Even those who argued returned the next day, as if unwilling to let him speak unanswered. The church answered not with debate, but with warning. It named the burning of the crosses a grave offense against the medieval faith, an insult to the memory of the saints. It reminded Saint-Gilles of the punishment for heresy. They spoke of pyres not as history, but as possibility. And still, the crowd did not break. Some faltered. Some stepped back into the cathedral's shadow. But enough remained that the square still listened when Peter spoke, and that was enough to keep the bishop awake at night. Because a single voice, still heard, is harder to kill than a dozen already silent. In every corner of the town, the question deepened. Would this end in repentance or in fire? If you've ever wanted to see how far a crowd will go when belief begins to outweigh fear, stay with me, because Saint-Gilles was about to find out. The day they came for him, the bells rang for vespers, not for warning. The square was not filled with a roaring mob. It began with a knot of people, tight and silent, faces half known, some turned away, some watching too intently. The bishop's envoys stood among them, their dark robes stiff in the spring wind. Peter was speaking near the well when the first hand touched his shoulder. It was not a shove, more a claim, the kind that says you belong to us now. He didn't resist, not yet. The crowd parted slowly, some stepping back in fear, others pressing closer as if their nearness could shield him. But there are moments when a crowd stops being a shield and becomes a witness. They led him through the narrow streets, past the shops still open for trade. No one barred the way. A fishmonger bowed his head. A baker crossed herself without looking up. Every step toward the cloister was a reminder. These walls had once sheltered him. Now they would hold him for judgment. Inside, the questions came sharp. Did he deny the cross? Did he reject the sacraments? Would he recant his words before the people? He answered with the same sentences he had given in the square. Calm, deliberate, without apology. The envoys did not shout. They recorded. Each refusal was inked as another nail. Outside, the square filled again, not with chanting, but with murmurs, the low, steady sound of people telling each other what they thought they saw. Hours passed. By dusk, the air had cooled, but the tension had not. The doors of the cloister remained shut. The windows above stayed dark. No message came, no verdict. Only the heavy toll of the bell at nightfall, each strike echoing against stone. When the doors finally opened, it was not to release him. A cart waited, plain and unmarked, its wheels creaking under the weight of what it carried. Not supplies, not relics. The torches lit faces, and the faces looked away. Saint-Gilles understood then. This would not end in a sermon. It would end in the square. They built the pyre as if it were a duty, not a crime. In the heart of Saint-Gilles, timbers were dragged in from workshops and yards. Not fresh cut. These were beams with splinters already worn smooth by hands, boards that had once held up roofs or stalls. Kindling was packed tight between them. Strips of cloth hung loose where resin dripped. At the center stood a stake, pale against the deepening dusk. It leaned slightly until a mason struck it straight. The work was quiet, methodical. The murmurs of the crowd were muffled, as though the air itself had thickened. Then came the books, some bound in leather, others no more than stitched sheaves of parchment, the words he had carried across Provence. They were dropped at the base of the pyre, spines cracking, pages shivering in the wind. A boy bent to read a line. His mother pulled him back, but not before his lips formed the words aloud. Peter was brought forward between two men. His robe hung loose on his shoulders. His face was neither defiant nor broken, only steady. He looked once at the pyre, then at the faces around it. Some could not hold his gaze. Others met it, wide-eyed, as if willing him to speak. The bishop's envoy read the sentence: heresy against the medieval church, desecration of the cross, refusal to recant. The words rolled out like stones, one after another, until the list itself felt heavier than the wood. When they bound his hands, he did not pray aloud. A spark touched the kindling. Smoke rose in thin threads before the first flame caught. It curled through the books, licking ink into black ash. The wind shifted, carrying the scent into the crowd: parchment, oak, and something sharper. Voices began to rise. Not cheers, not yet. The sound was closer to a chant without words, the restless stirring of people who do not know whether they are watching justice or vengeance. A woman crossed herself 3 times. A man removed his cap and held it to his chest. Peter lifted his head once more. His eyes moved over the crowd as if searching for something or someone to remember. The flames reached higher. The envoy stepped back. The wood groaned under the weight of its own burning. And as the fire found its way upward, it began to erase not just a man, but the question of whether he might have been right. By morning, there was nothing left of him but ash and memory. The square bore no sign of the pyre. The wood swept away, the ground raked clean. But the smell lingered. It clung to the market stalls, to the cloth hanging from windows, to the hair of those who had stood too close. The church had its verdict, yet Saint-Gilles had something else: the uneasy knowledge of what it had witnessed. The books were gone, but the words had not burned so easily. Men at the wharf still repeated his questions. Women at the well still argued in low voices. A shepherd heading for the hills carried a sentence in his head he could not quite shake. When a man dies for what he refuses to recant, does the fire silence him or spread him? The bishop's envoys left with the air of a battle won. They had erased the heretic, restored the symbol, reasserted the order. But order depends on hearts, and hearts cannot be raked clean like a square. Some who had stood in the crowd avoided the cathedral that Sunday. Others came but glanced at the altar as if seeing it for the first time. A few knelt longer than usual, not in devotion, in thought. In the weeks that followed, whispers crossed the Rhône into other towns. The name Peter of Bruys was spoken carefully, sometimes with scorn, sometimes with respect, always with the weight of something dangerous. The Petrobrusian ideas did not gather in cathedrals. They moved along roads, in the saddlebags of merchants, in the pockets of letters never shown to priests. The church had burned a man, but found that belief is harder to set alight. Saint-Gilles carried on. Markets opened, bells rang, the river flowed. Yet beneath the rhythm there was a seam that had been split and could not be sewn back as it was. The question he left behind, about wood and ritual and truth had lodged itself where fire could not reach. In the world of Peter of Bruys, belief was law, and questioning it was a death sentence. Today, we live in a time where questions are often encouraged, debated, even celebrated. But freedom to speak is not the same as courage to speak. And in that, perhaps the past still has something to teach us. Peter lost his life, his books, his place in the church. The town of Saint-Gilles lost its certainty, but gained a scar that made it look at faith differently. The church kept its order, but could not erase the doubts his words had planted. History leaves us with this balance: what we keep, what we lose, and what refuses to die. If you found this story worth remembering, I'd be grateful if you subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. Your thoughts help keep these histories alive. And if you want more tales from the dark heart of the medieval world, watch the next video in our playlist. Royal Blood and Tortures, The Dark Medieval Tales. I'll see you in the next story.